Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about a 1956 movie. This is Death in the Garden. It's directed by Luis Bunuel. I set a goal for myself when I started this channel earlier in the year that I would do three videos a week. I've pretty much kept to that. I've already done my three videos for this week, but I watched this movie that I purchased in the recent Kino Lorber June Soon sale. I watched it in the afternoon. I was just bowled over by it. And I watched all the extras last night, so my enthusiasm has got the best of me, so I'm going to do another video. The reason I do three videos a week is if you've never done something like this, you have no idea how mentally exhausting it can be, both in trying to figure out what to say and also actually the actual process of doing it. So Death in the Garden is, I'm a big Louis Bunuel fan, and I was lucky enough to be a member of a film society back in the 70s and 80s, in which the programmer showed quite a few of Louis Bunuel's Mexican movies. It's sort of like Bunuel became part of the European art house circuit, probably with Belle de Jour, which was around 1968. And continued on with about half a dozen more films that all played in big cities and all through the United States on a very thriving art film circuit, of which Louis Bunuel was one of the big stars. But in the 1950s, he was in virtual obscurity, not quite virtual obscurity, but Death in the Garden is a very unusual film for him. He actually made three films that were co-produced for France and Mexico. So he used Mexican actors in the supporting roles, but the lead roles were all French, and this is one of these three films, Death in the Garden, filmed magnificently in Eastman color. The only time I ever saw this film before was in an absolutely horrible print on television, so it was a amazing revelation to see the colors popping out, the clarity, the detail. It's just a tremendous restoration that they did on Death in the Garden. And the film stars Georges Marchal. Georges Marchal was a big star in France. He was in very commercial films in the 1950s, largely forgotten today. He was a good friend of Louis Bunuel. One of these other French co-productions he used him for, he pops up in some of his other, he's in Belle de Jour and Milky Way. Later on, he is a He-Man, take your shirt off kind of actor, full of energy, vitality, perfectly suited for the role that he plays in Death in the Garden. Also stars Simone Signoret, and here's a shot of Marchal and Simone Signoret. She is just absolutely gorgeous in this movie. She had blonde hair, ruby red lips, felt figure. She is, I think her previous film was Diabolique for Clouseau, and she was making movies of female characters that were either prostitutes or they weren't exactly on the up and up. Bunuel just films her gorgeously in this film in Eastman color. Then we have Charles Vanel. Vanel was one of the mainstays of French acting, movie star, but basically a character actor who was also a movie star. He was in some silent films in the 19-teens. He made films in the 1980s, like Three Brothers. Remember him mostly for Wooden Crosses and La Miserable for Raymond Bernard in the 1930s, but so many great films. And he was also in La Diabolique, played the commissar, and he was also in The Wages of Fear. This is a movie set in South Africa, Death in the Garden, as was The Wages of Fear. I think he was in his 50s, close to 60 at the time. He almost drowns in a pool of oil in The Wages of Fear, and he goes through, as this whole cast does in the second half of the film, he goes through some very, what must have been very arduous task. And then we have a very early role, probably one of the first significant roles Michel Piccoli played. He, of course, went on to become a major European star, worked for just about every great director, He even worked in Topaz with Alfred Hitchcock, but every European great director. He plays a priest in this film. There's not always, but there's usually a priest in a Luis Bunuel film. And then we also have Michel Garridon, and she plays the daughter of Charles Vanel, and she is a deaf mute in this film, plays a deaf mute in this film, and she might look, it's not a real good picture of her, but she might look familiar to Howard Hawks fans, as she played the owner of the game farm in Howard Hawks' Hatari with John Wayne. So those are the 5 major leads, and this is really an incredible cast. Probably the first movie that Luis Bunuel made was such a fantastic cast. Simone Signoret, a big star. George Michel, Charles Vanel. Michel Piccoli was not a big star, but he was soon to become one. It's a 2-part plot. It's set in a South American town in which there's diamond prospectors who are busy at work. Charles Vanel is one of those, and the government comes in and tells them they're going to have to shut down. Only the government can do this type of mining, and they rebel against that. So we have an adventure story with much. There's jailbreaks, there's gun duels, there's explosions. It's a Hollywood kind of film, at least in some respects. And then the second half is these 5 characters, the 5 actors that I've named, have to get out. They have to get out of town because this mini revolution, they've been caught up with it, and some of them are being pursued by the police or the soldiers that come from a neighboring town that are going to clean up the mess that this mini revolution has caused. So they go down the river. They want to escape to another country, Brazil. But the police boats are hot on their trail, so they have to abandon their boat, and they go off into the jungle, and the soldiers chasing them say, well, we'll wait by the river, but there's no way, they're never going to survive that jungle. This is the garden, the death in the garden, and this is not a Garden of Eden, even though there is a snake. This is a dense jungle that is really tests their mettle for survival. And again, this is Bunuel's Mexican period, in which he actually went to Hollywood, I believe in the 1930s. He had worked, I believe he worked 6 months for MGM. He worked, I think he was there 3 or 4 years, but he never really did anything. And I think he was trying, he had already had these surrealist films that caused quite a stir early in the 1930s. So he was somewhat known, but not in America. America was full of immigrants coming from all parts of the world. Bunuel was getting away from Spain and eventually away from Franco. The military oppression of Death in the Garden, you see that in a lot of Bunuel films because it stands in for what he saw as the oppressive nature of the right-wing nationalist dictatorship of Generalissimo Franco. And but there's all, even though this strikes one as an adventure story that Hollywood would eat up, but it's given that Bunuelian twist because Bunuel had a certain style that probably wouldn't have fit Hollywood. He wanted to make personal films, but he also wanted to make commercial films. Bunuel never sniffed at commercial films and big stars. He often worked with the biggest stars that he could get, but his films have a sense of sort of, they're not sentimental, and they have a high. They can have a high ratio of emotional cruelty of people to people. He looked at people clear-eyed. He was a surrealist, but he also was, his films are naturalistic. He didn't like expressionism. He sees things, he tries to see people as they really are and what they can do. And they do, there's the cruelty element, but there's also a humane element. in his characters too, and you never know when that's gonna surface. And we see that, especially in George Marchel's performance, because in the beginning he's this bandit, he doesn't care about anything. He's humanized as the film, and when they go to the jungle, these other four people are totally dependent on him. He's the energetic, the lively one. He'll and optimistic one. I'm going to get you out of this. We're going to find Brazil. And so Bunuel keeps saying you never really know what's going to come, how these characters are going to develop, and because Bunuel just loved the oddness of human beings and the oddness of the societies that human beings create for themselves. He was a critic of it. He was subversive. He was part of the surrealist movement. He was actually part of the Communist Party at one time. It's hard to imagine Bunuel, he was kicked out of both, and it's hard to imagine Bunuel ever really adopting himself to an orthodoxy, because his films are subversive to really all kinds of orthodoxies. He wrote a great autobiography called My Last Sigh. It's usually translated as. It's not a conventional autobiography. He skips around in time, but one of the things that's remarkable about him, as subversive as he was in his art, and as critical as he was of society and what are called traditional values, he himself was totally devoted to his wife and family, lived basically a bourgeois life. And he often chuckled. You see interviews. He was a really strange and humorous interviewee, and he chuckles at himself. Who's more straight-laced than me? And there's a great commentary here by Sam Dagan. I always like it when she does commentaries and she gives a kind of feminist take on some of the aspects of the film. And we have, Simone Signoret with a very complex role. She seems to be totally avaricious, but then she seems to be someone that could have the capacity within her to love. A long 30-minute interview with Tony Raines, just magnificent in the way he puts the context of Death in the Garden into Bunuel's total career. And then there's also an essay, there's a little booklet that I showed you some of the pictures of that shows the death in the garden. That's one of the deaths in the garden. And includes an essay that's also very good. So hopefully I conveyed some of my enthusiasm. I could talk about this movie for quite a longer period of time, but I don't like to go that far in my videos, because anybody who sticks with me, I appreciate so much, and I try to condense it a little bit. Next up, next week, New York, Martin Scorsese's overlooked musical masterpiece, maybe. I haven't seen it in a while. I saw it in the movies, both in its original Scorsese with the happy endings, 20 minutes restored, but also the cut that took it out, that took that passage out. So that'll be for next week. So thanks a lot, everybody, for listening to me, and you guys take care, and I'll catch you for New York.